You could not be present and sentient in the United States over the last week without being aware of the abuse of a United Airlines passenger, a physician on a recent flight who was forcibly removed from the plane, causing physical injury to the passenger. The CEO of United Airlines said he was being re-accommodated, a phrase which has created quite a bit of a media backlash. The entire story has, as one Twitter commentator put it, this was the day that United Airlines became presidential, a reference, of course, to Trump's bombing of Syria. Now, Joe Strupp rejoins us. Joe Strupp is a long-term veteran journalist covering the media itself. He is with Media Matters of America. He's interviewed a lot of leaders of the conservative media and covered a lot of stories about media distortion and so on. He has been on this story. He co-authored a piece with Pam Vogel in Media Matters that addressed the fact that one newspaper, at least, chose to focus on the quote-unquote troubled past of the passenger who was violently dragged off the plane, perhaps to the detriment of the newspaper industry itself. But we'll get into that. First of all, Joe, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Secondly, just on a personal level, I know I had a reaction when I first saw that story and that headline from the Courier-Journal saying that the Louisville hometown paper, saying the passenger's hometown paper, about the passenger's past, which was, even as a sort of a longtime media observer myself, I was kind of stunned. Were you as thrown? Maybe you're more of a veteran of the way the media covers things, but we're not talking about Fox here or Breitbart News. We're talking about a mainstream newspaper. Were you as surprised by it as I was?
I was, because it brings up the question, you know, what is valid news when you're looking at someone who's in the news? And obviously this person, Dr. David Dow, who the issues they brought up had been years ago. He had faced difficulties for drug prescription problems. He has been a doctor for a long time, but this was something that happened years ago, February 2005, I believe. I'm looking at the story as well. And he had gotten his license back years ago, and it had been done. You know, he is a local man, a local Kentucky man. So then the fact that he is, you know, a victim in this situation with United made many people wonder, why are you going into his past? I always say reporters have a right to find out information. They have a right to ask questions, but they don't necessarily have to use the information. And I think there could have been some judgment call here. We talked to some former editors, some journalism professors, who almost all of them agreed that this was either this is something that either shouldn't have been reported at all or should have been downplayed more, if at all. But the majority of them thought it was the same as you're saying. They were very surprised, almost shocked, that this person who had to suffer this humiliation and this abuse, physical abuse, would have to have his background scrutinized. And it's a thing that comes along where a lot of people refer to it as blaming the victim. It often comes along in sexual assaults and rape cases. But this is another form of it, where you dig up the person's past, say, wait a minute, this is something that should be known. Well, what does it have to do with what occurred here?
Well, and
a lot of people were
Joe,
surprised because they did make it a major issue.
Yeah, and Joe, just to jump in for a second, I've read the Courier-Journal story, and I kept, looking for the hook and thinking, maybe the story hadn't been fully reported yet. Maybe he was openly intoxicated or belligerent or violent, and I just hadn't heard that yet. So, I'm the next paragraph will surely tell me why they're reporting this. And it never came. It just seemed like, take a guy who's victimized and beaten up because he didn't want to relinquish his seat he had paid for and already been given, and just dig into his past for no reason. It just, so I was interested. Did you find anybody in doing your interviews about this? You know, you talked to the dean of the College of Communication at Boston University and so on. Did you find anybody who could justify this at all?
There was one professor at the University of Kentucky who had thought this was someone who actually had worked at the Courier-Journal. And we want to be clear, his name's Al Cross. He's a University of Kentucky journalism professor. He thought there was, as he put it, a natural curiosity about the person. But he also pointed out that to make this a featured story on their homepage was overdoing it, as he put it. He also said proportional coverage is an element of it that he thought was not handled properly. So he was one, and there were others who said it's interesting to find out what the background is on the person. I mean, that's natural, but they thought it was overdone. And again, this was the top story on their webpage yesterday for a long time, and I don't know how they handled it in print. We have to look and see, but it was something they played up, and that was the thing that other people also were concerned about. I mean, you could have put this down because he did get news coverage years ago in the local press for what happened to him. So it probably wouldn't have been problematic to maybe mention it, you know, paragraph 12,
right,
as kind of a throwaway. But I don't think any editor or reporter would be criticized for leaving it out. I think many are obviously being criticized for leaving it in, especially when the victim element of this is so great. I mean, here's someone who was, you know, he wasn't just arguing and forced to leave the plane, which happens to some people, and that's problematic enough for someone. He was, you know, violently removed, and it was video of this, so there was no doubt what happened to him, bleeding. And also, then it turned out that the he and others were, because he wasn't the only one removed, although he was the only one forcibly removed. They were removed so an employee of United could fly.
Right.
It's not as though there was some, you know, relevant reason to have them leave, that the plane was going to be unsafe, or that they were overbooked and somehow they were given a seat that someone else should have had for whatever reason. You know, you're displacing your customer for your employee, which just seems not only problematic and unfair, but just bad business.
Well, and
now they're having a PR nightmare that is going to cost them a lot more than, you know, putting these employees on another flight would have cost.
Yeah, it's going to cost them millions of dollars, whereas they could have bought tickets for their employees. They could have increased their offer and their search for volunteers and offered more money.
That's another thing that's come up, yeah.
Yeah, so, and I guess, look, I'm a news junkie, right? I mean, I read stuff.
Oh, yeah, me too.
I read stuff I have no business reading just because I'm a news addict. I didn't really even care about this. I mean, that's how off the map it is. You know, I wanted to ask you about something else, Joe, about this story, which is, as you and I both know, the corporate world has, you know, something called crisis management services available to it, where when a big corporation finds itself with a nightmare news story dominating the media, the crisis management team swoops in and they try to turn the story around in a variety of ways. Now, one of the standard ways that they may do it is if somebody seems to be a victim of the corporation's wrongdoing, they dig into the victim's past and they plant a negative story. Now, I've seen no evidence that crisis management was behind the Courier-Journal story. Is there any chance that this was part of a United strategy, or that this was part of a crisis management strategy to protect United, or is this just a dumb decision on the part of the Courier-Journal, you think?
Where you're saying that United might have had a hand in pushing the... No, it doesn't seem that way because, like I said, this is someone who had been in the news in the local area, who had a Louisville news element from years ago. My guess is they started to look him up, or even might have just remembered who he was, which I would have done too if something happened. If I was I worked at local papers, as you know, as did many of you, and if something happened to a local person, you look up who is this guy, and it probably was something they could have tracked down pretty easily.
Yeah.
I don't know that. I think United again has mishandled this in many other ways, where they put out statements that use the term you used of what was it, re-accommodating?
Re-accommodating.
And then it also came out that the president of United had put out a message to employees that was critical of Dow as well. And no one seems to want to say, you know what, we screwed up. and we should do everything not to let this get beyond where it did. And apparently it's too late. But that's what happens when, like you said, it's big corporations. The Courier Journal is also owned by a big corporation, Gannett. Not that that necessarily had anything to do with it, because these decisions are made on the local level. But it's another reminder that when you don't have local ownership of a paper, they don't have to, account for the actions of the paper as much as they used to when most of the papers were locally owned. Now they're owned by corporations who are not even in town.
Joe,
that's
actually
say that the Courier Journal doesn't have local connections, but it's just an interesting side element as well.
It's actually a great point, Joe. The Gannett has done some great reporting. There are some great reporters there, so I don't want to dismiss the whole organization.
Absolutely.
But I will say that in the days when newspapers were part of their community in a way that is not the case now, there was a certain community accountability and community participation and a sense of responsibility to the community that's kind of gone out of the newspaper business, don't you think?
Absolutely. And again, the idea that we dig up information and we have to get it out there. I always say, just because you learn something as a reporter doesn't mean it has to be reported. One of the things I like about this story is there are different opinions on how to go about, how do you report something like this. In this case, though, most of the opinions we found strongly criticize the Courier Journal. But there are other situations where there is sort of a mixed bag. What do you do? And I think it goes to also the idea that nowadays when people think, and I'm an old newspaper guy, I'm a bit of a stubborn guy when it comes to saying, well, anyone can be a reporter. I think people can get on the web and report things, and a lot of news gets out because, quote, citizen journalists are out there reporting it. But I think it still takes an editorial judgment, someone with experience and training, to say, wait, let's stop for a minute here. Is this news that we need to report? And in today's 24-hour, competitive atmosphere, people are in such a rush to get things out. Not only do they not check them, but even when they check them, they obviously had the facts right here. They don't say, wait a minute, is this something we need to report? And many people might have said, no, let's hold off on a minute. It also raises I don't know if you know the story that's come up. A lot of people mentioned the story that occurred in 1975 in San Francisco when Sarah Jane Moore tried to assassinate President Ford. The story, the man who stopped her, who grabbed the gun, got a lot of attention, but he was also outed as a gay man. And of course, in 1975, even in San Francisco, gay people were not given the proper treatment that they're hopefully getting more of today. And there were stories done afterwards that it really hurt his personal life. His family he had problems with his family after that, and a lot of just personal problems came out because his personal life was exposed. Not something he wanted out there, no pun intended. But that's a kind of an example of this that went back to 1975. And he was a hero in that case. He wasn't, this man was a victim, which is bad enough. This man was a hero. He basically helped save the president's life, and this is what he got. His personal life was put out there. And there are other examples of this as well, but that's the one that kind of many journalists point to as sort of the example of how it can go wrong.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Joe. And I would say that even though the media landscape has changed since then, you have citizen journalists and electronic media and blogs and so on, I think the difference still today is that when something goes out with the branding of a professional news organization, and that includes the Louisville Courier Journal,
yes,
that you need to be held to a different standard of journalistic responsibility.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's
someone made a decision, and who knows what kind of discussions went on. They really got it up there pretty quickly, and it would have been interesting if they at least said, well, maybe we did make a mistake, or maybe we should have thought this through. So far, I haven't seen that, but there's still time.
Yeah,
and of course now Mr. Dow is probably looking at his legal options. I'm not big on suing newspapers, and I doubt they would. I don't know that they would have a case. He would have a case against the newspaper, but it would be an interesting public figure kind of privacy case. But he's definitely, I'm sure, going to have a case against the airline, which many lawyers, I'm sure, are in touch with him to figure that one out.
I'm sure he's got that one covered. And I would love to see just a thoughtful piece from the editor of the Louisville Courier Journal, thinking through what they might have done better. But Joe Strupp of Media Matters, as always, great to talk to you. Thanks for covering this story, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Always glad to be here.